Chapter 11. The Need for Service Rather than Leadership. In this untoward situation, the Negro finds himself at the close of the third generation from emancipation. He has been educated in the sense that persons directed a certain way are more easily controlled, or as Ovid remarked, in time the bull is brought to bear the yoke. The Negro in this state continues as a child. He is restricted in his fear to small things, and with these he becomes satisfied. His ambition does not rise any higher than to plunge into the competition with his fellows for these trifles. At the same time, those who have given the race such false ideals are busy in the highest spheres, from which Negroes, by their miseducation and racial guidance, have been disbarred. Examples of this failure of the miseducated Negro to have high ideals may be cited. The author has known numerous cases of Negro lawyers, physicians, and businessmen who, while attending local Sunday schools, churches, and lodges, have fallen out about trifles like a resolution or the chairmanship of a committee, which so embittered them as to make themselves enemies for life and stumbling blocks preventing any such thing as organization or community cooperation. It is a common occurrence to see a Negro well situated as a minister or teacher aspiring to a political appointment which temporarily pays little more than what he is receiving and offers no distinction except that of being earmarked as a Jim Crow job set aside for some Negro who has served well the purposes of the bosses as a ward heeler in a campaign. Negroes who have begun promising business enterprises sometimes abandon them temporarily for the same sort of empty honor. In this way they have been known to hamper their business by incurring the displeasure of ambitious politicians who might otherwise patronize them. Negroes of this point of view have developed in that part of the country where it is thought that the most distinguished persons in the community are those who hold and exploit the local offices, or those who are further honored with positions in the state and nation. While this may apply in the case of their oppressors, the few positions allotted the Negroes are magnified beyond all reasonable bounds. This comes as a natural result, however, for the education of the Negro requires it. The ambitious, miseducated Negro in the struggle for the little things allotted by others prevents any achievement of the people in matters more constructive. Potentially, the colored people are strong, although they are actually weak. This much ado about nothing renders impossible cooperation, the most essential thing in the development of a people. The ambitious of this class do more to keep the race in a state of turmoil and to prevent it from serious community effort than all the other elements combined. The one has a job that the other wants, or the one is a leader of a successful faction, and the other is struggling to supplant him. Everything in the community then must yield ground to this puerile contest. In one city of a few thousand Negroes, there is no chance for community cooperation because of the antagonism of the Methodist and Baptist preachers in charge of the two largest churches. The one is determined to dictate the appointment of the teaching corps and the social welfare workers. The other is persistently struggling to undo everything accomplished by his opponent. The one is up today and the other in ascendancy tomorrow. Several efforts have been made to start business enterprises there, but none has succeeded because one faction tears down what the other builds up. In another city, the cleavage is along political lines. Preachers are there, but a lawyer and a dentist, plunging into politics, have dispossessed the clergy of the stage. The leader of one faction is so bitterly opposed to the other that he even warns strangers against going to the home of his adversary. To present a sane proposition to the community through one of these leaders means local warfare rather than an effort to work together for the common good. Consequently, although there are thousands of Negroes living together in one quarter, they have no business enterprises of worth. The selfish struggle for personal aggrandizement, which has not yet brought either faction more than an appointment on the police force or a clerkship in one of the city offices, thus blocks the social and economic progress of thousands of unoffending people. In another state, the ambition of the highly educated Negro is restricted to becoming principals of the high schools. The neglected state school has not developed sufficiently to become attractive. The warring area, then, is in the cities. In one of them, where several Negroes own considerable wealth, which, if pooled and properly used, would produce all but wonderful results, the petty strife has been most disastrous. Little thought is given to social uplift, and economic effort is crushed by factional wrangling. Before the author had been in one of the towns an hour, a stalwart of one faction sounded him on becoming a candidate for the position held by the principal of the high school. A few minutes thereafter, another approached him for advice as to how, quote, to get him out. The high cost of this childishness to the community can be estimated only by taking into consideration the fact that this strife is all but endless. If it were a matter that developed now and then only to be forgotten by people directing their attention thereafter to more important things, it would not do much harm. But this confusion continues for years. Sometimes it grips a community for a whole generation, vitiating the entire life of the people. In spite of the meager rewards, however, the idea of leadership looms high in the Negro mind. It always develops thus among oppressed people. The oppressor must have some dealing with the despised group, and rather than have contact with individuals, he approaches the masses through his own spokesman. The term itself connotes a backward condition. In its strides upward, a race shuffles off its leaders because they originate outside of the group. They constitute a load that sinks the oppressed in the mire of trials and tribulations. Leadership is usually superimposed for the purpose of directing the course of the ostracized group along sane lines. This was accomplished during the days of slavery by restricting the assembly of Negroes to certain times and places, and compelling them to meet in the presence of a stipulated number of the, quote, wisest and discreetest men of the community. These supervisors of the conduct of Negroes would prevent them from learning the truth, which might make them unruly or ambitious to become free. After the Negroes became free, the same end was reached by employing a Negro or some white man to spy upon and report behind closed doors on a plan to enslave the Negroes' minds. In case that actual employment as a spy seemed too bold, the person to be used as such an instrument took up some sort of enterprise which the oppressors of the race warmly supported to give him the desired influence in the community. This quote-unquote racial racketeer might be a politician, minister, teacher, director of a community center, or head of a quote-unquote social uplift agency. As long as he did certain things and expressed the popular opinion on questions, he lacked nothing, and those who followed him found their way apparently better paid as the years went by. His leadership then was recognized, and the ultimate undoing of the Negroes in the community was assured. Such leadership, too, has continued into our day, and it goes from bad to worse. The very service which this racial toady renders hardens him to the extent that he loses his soul. He becomes equal to any task the oppressor may impose upon him, and at the same time he becomes artful enough to press his case convincingly before the thoughtless multitude. What is right is sacrificed, because everything that is right is not expedient, and what is expedient soon becomes unnecessary. Recently, a citizen, observing how we have been thus betrayed, suggested that there be called a national meeting to take steps for a program of development of the race from within under a new leadership. Such a movement can be made to mean something, and then it can degenerate into an assembly of abuse and vituperation, followed by the usual, whereas, therefore be it resolved effort, which has never meant anything in the awakening and the development of an oppressed people. The Negroes, however, will not advance far if they continue to waste their energy abusing those who misdirect and exploit them. The exploiters of the race are not so much at fault as the race itself. If Negroes persist in permitting themselves to be handled in this fashion, they will always find someone at hand to impose upon them. The matter is one which rests largely with the Negroes themselves. The race will free itself from exploiters just as soon as it decides to do so. No one else can accomplish this task for the race. It must plan and do for itself. Checking up on what they do, Negroes often find themselves giving money and moral support to various persons and institutions which influence the course of the race in the wrong way. They do not often ask themselves whether the support thus given will redound in the long run to the good of the people with whom they are identified. They do not inquire whether the assistance thus given offers temporary relief, but eventually results in irreparable loss. So many Negroes often do themselves harm when they actually believe that they are doing good. Under their present teachers, they cannot easily learn to do any better, for such training as we undergo does not open our eyes sufficiently for us to see far ahead of us. If the Negro could abandon the idea of leadership and instead stimulate a larger number of the race to take up definite tasks and sacrifice their time and energy in doing these things efficiently, the race might accomplish something. The race needs workers, not leaders. Such workers will solve the problems which race leaders talk about and raise money to enable them to talk more and more about. When you hear a man talking, then always inquire as to what he is doing or what he has done for humanity. Oratory and resolutions do not avail much. If they did, the Negro race would be in a paradise on earth. It may be well to repeat here the saying that old men talk of what they have done, young men of what they are doing, and fools of what they expect to do. The Negro race has a rather large share of the last mentioned class. If we can finally succeed in translating the idea of leadership into that of service, we may soon find it possible to lift the Negro to a higher level. Under leadership, we have come into the ghetto. By service within the ranks, we may work our way out of it. Under leadership, we have been constrained to do the biddings of others. By service, we may work out a program in the light of our own circumstances. Under leadership, we have become poverty-stricken. By service, we may teach the masses how to earn a living honestly. Under leadership, we have been made to despise our own possibilities and to develop into parasites. By service, we may prove sufficient unto the task of self-development and contribute our part to modern culture. Chapter 12. Hirelings in the places of public servants. If the highly educated Negroes have not learned better the simple lessons of life, one cannot expect the laboring classes to conduct themselves differently. In the large number of cases, the employers of Negroes in common labor, in which most of them are now engaged, assert that there is no hope for advancement of Negroes in their employ because Negroes will not work under foremen of their own color. In other words, the average Negro has not yet developed to the point that one is willing to take orders from another of his own race. While it is true that such an answer is often given as a mere excuse for not placing Negroes in responsible positions when it can be done without any particular trouble, the investigation among Negroes themselves reveals numerous facts to prove that there is more truth than falsehood in this statement. Hundreds of employees of African blood frankly say that they will not work under a Negro. One is afraid that the other may prosper more than he does and be recognized accordingly. Some of these instances are interesting. A head of one of the government departments in which Negro women are employed to do unskilled labor reports that he placed in charge of the group of these workers an intelligent colored woman who seemed to have all of the necessary qualifications which he had found in other women thus employed. Those working under her, however, refused to obey instructions, kept the place in turmoil, and soon destroyed the morale of the whole force. As soon as he placed a white woman in charge, however, order was re-established on the premises, and everything moved along smoothly. Another employer, conducting a wholesale business, placed a Negro foreman in charge of others of his race to function as one of the important departments of the establishment. The Negroes working under him, who had formerly taken orders without question from the white foreman, soon undertook to take liberties with the promoted Negro and to ignore his orders. Knowing that the Negro foreman was well qualified, however, and being personally interested in him, the employer, instead of doing what so many others under such circumstances had done, dismissed those who refused to cooperate and supplied the vacancies with others until an efficient working force could thus be obtained. Only a few employers, however, have had such patience and have manifested such interest in the advancement of the Negro. As a rule, they merely dispose of Negro foremen with the excuse that one Negro will not take orders from another. This refusal of Negroes to take orders from one another is due largely to the fact that slaveholders taught their bondmen that they were as good as or better than any others, and therefore should not be subjected to any member of their race. If they were to be subordinated to someone, it should be to the white man of superior culture and social position. This keeps the whole race on a lower level, restricted to the atmosphere of trifles which do not concern their traducers. The greater things of life, which can be attained only by wise leadership, then, they have no way to accomplish. The strong have always used this as a means of dealing with the so-called weaker races of the world. The Caucasian arrays the one against the other, so that they may never combine their forces and thus deprive their so-called superiors of control over them, which they could easily do if organized. One white man was thus able to maintain himself on a plantation where there were 30 or 40 slaves, because the Negroes were miseducated in such a way as to keep them divided into distinct factions. In petty strife, their power would be lost in the process of attrition. Today we find the same thing in Africa, where this end is reached by embittering one tribe against another. And it worked the same way in India until recently, when it began to break down under the masterful leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. The Negroes of the United States have followed leadership slavishly, but sometimes, unfortunately, that of those leaders who are selected for them by the traducers of the race. The enemies of the race, for example, will find a Negro willing to do certain things they desire to have accomplished, and will finance him and give him sufficient publicity to get before the world, for the few favors which he may dispense among his followers as a result of his influence and economic position will bring to him the adequate number of Negroes for the constituency which he desires. Negroes, however, sometimes choose their own leaders, but unfortunately they are too often of the wrong kind. Negroes do not readily follow persons with constructive programs. Almost any sort of exciting appeal or trivial matter presented to them may receive immediate attention and temporarily, at least, liberal support. When the bubble collapses, of course, these same followers will begin to decry Negro leadership and call these misrepresentatives of the group rascals and scoundrels. Inasmuch as they have failed to exercise foresight, however, those who have deceived them should not be blamed so much as those who have liberally supported these impostors. Yet the fault here is not inherently in the Negro, but in what he has been taught. The Negro's point of view, therefore, must be changed before they can construct a program which will bring them out of the wilderness. For example, no good can be expected from one of our teachers who said that she had to give up her class in Sunday school to accept an extra job of waiting on tables at that hour because she had bought a $2,400 coat and her husband had purchased an expensive car. Such a teacher has no message for the Negro child. Her example would tend to drag the youth downward, and the very thought of having such a person in the schoolroom is most depressing. We must feel equally discouraged when we see a minister driving up to his church on Sunday morning in a Cadillac. He does not come to feed the multitude spiritually. He comes to fleece the flock. The appeal he makes is usually emotional. While the people are feeling happy, the expensive machine is granted and the prolonged vacation to use it is easily financed. Thus, the thoughtless drift backward toward slavery. When you see a physician drive to one's door in his Pierce Arrow, you cannot get the impression he has come to treat the patient for a complaint. He has come to treat him for $1. Such physicians, as a rule, know less and less medicine as the years go by, although they make much money by learning human psychology and using it for personal gain. With leeches of this type feeding upon an all but impoverished people and giving them nothing back, there can be no hope for advancement. No people can go forward when the majority of those who should know better have chosen to go backward. But this is exactly what most of our misleaders do. Not being learned in the history and background of the race, they figure out that there is no hope for the masses, and they decide then that the best thing they can do is to exploit these people for all they can and use the accumulations selfishly. Such persons have no vision and therefore perish at their own hands. It is an injustice to the Negro, however, to miseducate him and suffer his manners to be corrupted from infancy until old age, and then blame him for making the mistakes which such guidance necessitates. People who have been restricted and held down naturally condescend to the lower levels of delinquency. When education has been entirely neglected or improperly managed, we see the worst passions ruling with uncontrolled and incessant sway. Good sense degenerates into craft, anger wrangles into malignity, restraint, which is thought most solitary, comes too late, and the most judicial admonitions are urged in vain. Philosophers have long conceded, however, that every man has two educations, that which is given to him, and the other, that which he gives himself. Of the two kinds, the latter is by far the more desirable. Indeed, all that is most worthy in man, he must work out and conquer for himself. It is that which constitutes our real and best nourishment. What we are merely taught seldom nourishes the mind like that which we teach ourselves. The same eternal principle applies to a race forced to live apart from others as a separate and distinct group. Inasmuch as the education of the Negro has come from without, we can clearly see that he has received only a part of the development which he should have undergone, or he has developed negatively. The Negro lacks mental power, which cannot be expected from ill-fed brains. This naturally brings up a serious question. The people on the outside, who are directing the race from afar, will take this condition of affairs as evidence that the Negro is not prepared for leadership. What they ought to say is that they have not prepared the Negro to assume the responsibility of his own uplift. Instead of doing this, however, they play up this result of their own failure as an argument for imposing upon the Negro race the guidance of others from without. As to whether or not a white man should be a leader of the Negroes may be dismissed as a silly question. What has the color to do with it? Such a worker may be white, brown, yellow, or red, if he is heart and soul with the people whom he would serve. It just happens, however, that most white men now in control of Negro institutions are not of this required type. Practically all of those with whom I have talked and communicated believe in imposing some sort of disability upon Negroes, some object to the freedom of intermarriage as a substitute for concubinage, scoff at the idea of the enfranchisement of the Negroes, approve their segregation, and justify the economic exploitation of the race. Now, if these are the persons to elevate the Negroes, to what point do they expect to lift them? And what will the Negroes be when they get there? With this same thought in mind, a white director of Negroes recently said to the author, quote, "I realize that I have no useful function in my present position as a president of a Negro institution. I do not approve of their aspirations to many things. I cannot accept the students in my house as I would white students because it might lead to an interracial romance. Marrying is such a difficult problem at the best that I should not like to see one of my children make a failure in life by marrying a Negro." In other words, continued he, we live in two different worlds. While I am among them, I cannot be a part of them. How then can I help them under these circumstances? I am acquainted with another white educator at the head of a Negro institution, who will not address a colored girl as Miss, and to avoid the use of a title in speaking to women of the race, he addresses them as his kin. One of them was sharp enough to reply to him thus when he accosted her as auntie. Quote, "Oh, I am so glad that I have found my lost relatives at last. My mother often told me that I had some distinguished kin, and just to think that you are my nephew makes me feel glad." End quote. Another such exploiter in charge of a Negro college never wears his hat on campus. His confidential explanation is that he might have to lift it when he meets a Negro woman. Of course, that would never do. Quote unquote, white supremacy would be lost in the Negro school. As we realize more and more that education is not merely imparting information which is expected to produce certain results, we see very clearly the inconsistency of the position of white persons as executives of Negro institutions. These misfits belong to the very group working out the segregation of the Negro, and they come into these institutions mainly to earn a living. They make no particular contribution to the development of education, for they are not scholarly enough to influence educational theory, and they are so far out of sympathy with the Negro that they cannot make any contribution to educational practice. These quote-unquote foreigners are not bringing to such institutions large sums of money which the Negroes cannot obtain, for the institutions now directed by Negroes are receiving larger appropriations than those under the management of whites. Our so-called thinkers, however, seldom see the inevitable results of this unsound policy. Not long ago, when the author wrote the textbook entitled Negro Makers of History, it was adversely criticized by a Negro who said that the book should have had as an illustration the cut of the white man who established a certain Negro college. The author had to explain that the book was to give an account of what the Negro has done, not of what has been done for him. The school referred to, moreover, was in no sense a Negro school. It had very few Negro teachers and only one Negro trustee. The policy of the school was determined altogether by others without giving the Negro credit for having a thought on education. In other words, it was merely a school which Negroes were permitted to attend. If they picked up here and there something to help them, well and good. If not, may God help them. It is all right to have a white man as the head of a Negro college, or to have a red man at the head of a yellow one, if, in each case, the incumbent has taken out his naturalization papers and has identified himself as one of the group which he is trying to serve. It seems that the white educators of this day are unwilling to do this, and for that reason they can never contribute to the actual development of the Negro from within. You cannot serve people by giving them orders as to what to do. The real servant of the people must live among them, think with them, feel for them, and die for them. The white worker in Negro institutions, too, can never be successful without manifesting some faith in the people with whom he has cast his lot. His efforts must not be merely an attempt to stimulate their imitation of things in a foreign sphere. He must study his community sufficiently to discover the things which have a trend in the proper direction, that he may stimulate such forces and thus help the community to do better the good things which it may be capable of doing, and at the same time may be interested in doing. If these people are to be brought the ideas of quote-unquote foreigners and must be miraculously transformed into something else before anything can be made of them, such effort will be a fruitless task, like most of the so-called education and uplift of the Negroes in America. The Negro, in spite of his confinement to the ghetto, has some opportunities to develop his special capacities if they are properly studied and understood. The real servant of the people, then, will give more attention to those to be served than to the use that somebody may want to make of them. He will be more concerned with what he can do to increase the ease, comfort, and happiness of the Negro than with how the Negro may be used to contribute to the ease, comfort, and happiness of others. The servant of the people, unlike the leader, is not on a high horse, elevated above the people and trying to carry them to some designated point to which he would like to go for his own advantage. The servant of the people is down among them, living as they live, doing what they do, and enjoying what they enjoy. He may be a little better informed than some other members of the group. It may be that he has had some experience that they have not had, but in spite of this advantage, he should have more humility than those whom he serves. For we are told that, quote, "Whosoever is greatest among you, let him be your servant." Chapter 13. Understand the Negro. We do not offer here any course in Negro history, Negro literature, or race relations, recently said a professor of a Negro college. We study the Negro along with other people. An excellent idea, the interviewer replied. No one should expect you to do any more than this. But how do you do it when the Negro is not mentioned in your textbooks except to be condemned? Do you, a teacher in a Negro school, also condemn the race in the same fashion as the writers of your textbooks of history and literature? No, said he. We bring the Negro in here and there. How often does here and there connote? Well, you know, said he, Negroes have not done much, and what they have accomplished may be briefly covered by referring to the achievements of a few men and women. Why do you emphasize the special study of the Negro? Said he further. Why is it necessary to give the race special attention in the press, on the rostrum, or in the schoolroom? This idea of projecting the Negro into the foreground does the race much harm by singing continually of his woes and problems, and thus alienating the public, which desires to give its attention to other things. It is true that many Negroes do not desire to hear anything about their race, and few whites of today will listen to the story of woe. With most of them, the race question has been settled. The Negro has been assigned to the lowest drudgery as the sphere in which the masses must toil to make a living, and socially and politically the race has been generally proscribed. Inasmuch as the traducers of the race have, quote, settled the matter in this fashion, they naturally oppose any effort to change this status. Many Negro professional men who are making a living attending to the affairs of these laborers and servants in their mentally undeveloped state, and many teachers who in conservative fashion are instructing their children to maintain the status quo antebellum, also oppose any movement to upset this arrangement. They are getting paid for their efforts. Why should they try innovations? The gods have so decreed it. Human beings cannot change it. Why be foolish? A Negro with sufficient thought to construct a program of his own is undesirable, and the educational systems of this country generally refuse to work through such Negroes in promoting their cause. The program for the uplift of the Negroes in this country must be handed over to an executive force like orders from the throne, and they must carry it out without question, or get out of line and let the procession go on. Although the Negro is being daily forced more and more by segregation into a world peculiarly his own, his unusually perplexing status is given little or no thought, and he is not considered capable of thinking for himself. The chief difficulty with the education of the Negro is that it has been largely imitation, resulting in the enslavement of his mind. Somebody outside of the race has desired to try out on Negroes some experiment which interested him and his co-workers, and Negroes, being objects of charity, have received them cordially and have done what they required. In fact, the keynote in the education of the Negro has been to do what he is told to do. Any Negro who has learned to do this is well prepared to function in the American social order as others would have him. Looking over the courses of study of the public schools, one finds little to show that the Negro figures in these curricula. In supplementary matter, a good deed of some Negro is occasionally referred to, but oftener the race is mentioned only to be held up to ridicule. With the exception of a few places like Atlantic City, Atlanta, Tulsa, St. Louis, Birmingham, Knoxville, and the states of Louisiana and North Carolina, no effort is made to study the Negro in the public schools as they do the Latin, the Teuton, or the Mongolian. Several miseducated Negroes themselves contend that the study of the Negro by children would bring before them the race problem prematurely, and therefore urge that the study of the race be deferred until they reach advanced work in the college or university. These misguided teachers ignore the fact that the race question is being brought before black and white children daily in their homes, in the streets, through the press, and on the rostrum. How then can the school ignore the duty of teaching the truth while these other agencies are playing up falsehood? The experience of college instructors shows that racial attitudes of the youth are not easily changed after they reach adolescence. Although students of this advanced stage are shown the fallacy of race superiority and the folly of social distinctions, they nevertheless continue to do the illogical thing of still looking upon these despised groups as less worthy than themselves and persist in treating them accordingly. Teachers of elementary and secondary schools giving attention to this interracial problem have succeeded in softening and changing the attitude of children whose judgment has not been so hopelessly warped by the general attitude of the communities in which they have been brought up. In approaching this problem in this fashion to counteract the one-sided education of youth, the thinking people of this country have no desire to upset the curricula of the schools or to force the Negro as such into public discussion. But if the Negro is to be elevated, he must be educated in the sense of being developed from what he is, and the public must be so enlightened as to think of the Negro as a man. Furthermore, no one can be thoroughly educated until he learns as much about the Negro as he knows about other people. Upon examining the recent catalogs of the leading Negro colleges, one finds that invariably they give courses in ancient, medieval, and modern Europe, but they do not give such courses in ancient, medieval, and modern Africa. Yet Africa, according to recent discoveries, has contributed about as much to the progress of mankind as Europe has, and the early civilization of the Mediterranean world was decidedly influenced by Africa. Negro colleges offer courses bearing on the European colonist prior to their coming to America, their settlement on these shores, and their development here toward independence. Why are they not equally generous with the Negroes in treating their status in Africa prior to enslavement, their first transplantation to the West Indies, the Latinization of certain Negroes in contradistinction to the development of others under the influence of the Teuton, and the effort of the race toward self-expression? A further examination of their curricula shows too that invariably these Negro colleges offer courses in Greek philosophy and in that of modern European thought, but they direct no attention to the philosophy of the African. Negroes of Africa have and always have had their own ideas about the nature of the universe, time and space, about appearance and reality, and about freedom and necessity. The effort of the Negro to interpret man's relation to the universe shows just as much intelligence as we find in the philosophy of the Greeks. There were many Africans who were just as wise as Socrates. Again, one observes in some of these catalogues numerous courses in art, but no well-defined course in Negro or African art, which early influenced that of the Greeks. Thinkers are now saying that the early culture of the Mediterranean was chiefly African. Most of these colleges do not even direct special attention to Negro music, in which the Negro has made his outstanding contribution in America. The unreasonable attitude is that because the whites do not have these things in their schools, the Negroes must not have them in theirs. The Catholics and Jews, therefore, are wrong in establishing special schools to teach their principles of religion, and the Germans in America are unwise in having their children taught their mother tongue. Such has been the education of Negroes. They have been taught facts of history, but have never learned to think. Their conception is that you go to school to find out what other people have done, and then you go out in life to imitate them. What they have done can be done by others, they contend, and they are right. They are wrong, however, in failing to realize that what others have done, we may not need to do. If we are to do identically the same thing from generation to generation, we would not make any progress. If we are to duplicate from century to century the same feats, the world will grow tired of such a monotonous performance. In this particular respect, quote, Negro education is a failure, and disastrously so, because in its present predicament the race is especially in need of vision and invention to give humanity something new. The world does not want and will never have the heroes and heroines of the past. What this age needs is an enlightened youth, not to undertake the task like theirs, but to imbibe the spirit of these great men and answer the present call of duty with equal nobleness of soul. Not only do the needs of generations vary, but the individuals themselves are not duplicates the one of the other, and being different in this respect, their only hope to function efficiently in society is to know themselves and the generation which they are to serve. The chief value in studying the records of others is to become better acquainted with oneself and with one's possibilities to live and to do in the present age. As long as Negroes continue to restrict themselves to doing what was necessary 100 or 1,000 years ago, they must naturally expect to be left out of the great scheme of things as they concern men of today. The most inviting field for discovery and invention, then, is the Negro himself, but he does not realize it. Frederica Bremer, when reflecting upon her visit to America about 1850, gave this country a new thought in saying to Americans, quote, "The romance of your history is the fate of the Negro." End quote. In this very thought lies unusual possibilities for the historian, the economist, the artist, and the philosopher. Why should the Negro writer seek a theme abroad when he has the greatest of all at home. The bondage of the Negro brought captive from Africa is one of the greatest dramas in history, and the writer who merely sees in that ordeal something to approve or condemn fails to understand the evolution of the human race. Negroes now studying dramatics go into our schools to reproduce Shakespeare, but mentally developed members of this race will see the possibilities of a greater drama in the tragedy of the man of color. Negroes graduating from conservatories of music dislike the singing of our folk songs. For some reason, such misguided persons think that they can improve on the productions of the foreign drama, or render the music of other people better than they can themselves. A knowledge of real history would lead one to think that slavery was one of the significant developments which, although evil in themselves, may redound sometimes to the advantage of the oppressed rather than that of the oppressor. Someone has said that the music of Poland was inspired by incidents of a struggle against the despots invading and partitioning their prostrate land. The Greeks never had an art until the country was overrun by hostile Orientals. Someone then began to immortalize in song the sons who went forth to fight for the native land. Another carved in marble the thought evoked by the example of the Greek youth who blocked the mountain pass with his body, or who bared his breast to the javelin to defend the liberty of his country. These things we call art. In our own country, the other elements of the population, being secure in their position, have never faced such a crisis, and the Europeans, after whose pattern American life is fashioned, have not recently had such an experience. White Americans, then, have produced no art at all, and that of Europe has reached the point of stagnation. Negroes who are imitating whites, then, are engaged in a most unprofitable performance. Why not interpret themselves anew to the world? If we had a few thinkers, we could expect great achievements on tomorrow. Some Negro with unusual insight would write an epic of bondage and freedom which would take its place with those of Homer and Virgil. Some Negro with aesthetic appreciation would construct from collected fragments of Negro music a grand opera that would move humanity to repentance. Some Negro of philosophic penetration would find a solace for the modern world in the soul of the Negro, and then men would be men because they are men. The Negro in his present plight, however, does not see possibilities until it is too late. He exercises much hindsight, and for that reason he loses ground in the hotly contested battles of life. The Negro as a rule waits until a thing happens before he tries to avert it. He is too much like a man whom the author once saw knocked down in a physical combat. Instead of dodging the blow when it was being dealt, he arose from his prostration, dodging it. For example, the author has just received a letter from a lady in Pittsburgh complaining that the librarian in one of its schools insists upon reading to the children, quote, a great deal of literature containing such words as nigger, blackie, little Sambo, etc. This lady therefore would like to place in that school some books by Negro authors. This is a commendable effort, but it comes a little late. We hope not too late. For centuries, such literature has been circulated among the children of the modern world, and they have therefore come to regard the Negro as inferior. Now that some of our similarly miseducated Negroes are seeing how they have been deceived, they are awakening to address themselves to a long neglected work. They should have been thinking about this generations ago, for they have a tremendous task before them today in dispelling this error and counteracting the results of such bias in our literature. There has just come, too, from a friend of humanity in Edinburgh, Scotland, a direful account of the increase in race prejudice in those parts. Sailors who had frequented the stronghold of race prejudice in South Africa undertook recently to prevent Negro men from socializing with Scotch women at a dance, and certain professors of the University of Edinburgh, with the same attitude, show so much of it in their teaching that this friend entreats us to send them informing books on the Negro. We are doing it. Here again, however, the effort to uproot error and popularize the truth comes rather late. The Negro, since freedom, has gone along grinning, whooping, and, quote, cutting capers, while the white man has applied himself to the task of defining the status of the Negro and compelling him to accept it as thus settled forever. While the Negro has been idle, propaganda has gone far ahead of history. Unfortunately, too, Negro scholars have assisted in the production of literature which gives this point of view. Chapter 14. The New Program. It seems only a reasonable proposition, then, that if under the present system which produced our leadership in religion, politics, and business, we have gone backward toward serfdom, or have at least been kept from advancing to real freedom, it is high time to develop another sort of leadership with a different educational system. In the first place, we must bear in mind that the Negro has never been educated. He has merely been informed about other things which he has not been permitted to do. The Negroes have been shoved out of the regular schools, through the rear door into the obscurity of the backyard, and told to imitate others whom they see from afar, or they have been permitted in some places to come into the public schools to see how others educate themselves. The program for the uplift of the Negro in this country must be based upon a scientific study of the Negro from within, to develop in him the power to do for himself what his oppressors will never do to elevate him to the level of others. Being without actual education, we have very few persons prepared to help the Negroes whom they have set out to lead. These persons are not all dishonest men and women. Many of them are sincere and believe that they are doing the race some great good and thus holding it backward. They must be awakened and shown the error of their ways. We have very few teachers because most of those with whom we are afflicted know nothing about the children whom they teach, or about their parents who influence the pupils more than the teachers themselves. When a boy comes to school without knowing his lesson, he should be studied instead of being punished. The boy who does well in the beginning of the year and lags behind near the end of the term should not always be censured or ridiculed. As a rule, such children are not responsible for their failures. Their parents and their social status account mainly for these shortcomings. The Negro teacher, then, must treat the disease rather than its symptoms. But can you expect teachers to revolutionize the social order for the good of the community? Indeed, we must expect this very thing. The educational system of a country is worthless unless it accomplishes this task. Men of scholarship and consequently of prophetic insight must show us the right way and lead us into the light which shines brighter and brighter. In the church, where we have much freedom and independence, we must get rid of preachers who are not prepared to help the people whom they exploit. The public must refuse to support men of this type. Ministers who are the creations of the old educational system must be awakened, and if this is impossible, they must be dethroned. Those who keep the people in ignorance and play upon their emotions must be exiled. The people have never been taught what religion is, for most of the preachers find it easier to stimulate the superstition which develops in the unenlightened mind. Religion in such hands, then, becomes something with which you take advantage of weak people. Why try to enlighten the people in such matters when superstition serves just as well for exploitation? The ministers with the confidence of the people must above all things understand the people themselves. They must find out the past of their parishioners, whether they were brought up in Georgia, Alabama, or Texas, whether they are housed under desirable circumstances, what they do to make a living, what they do with their earnings, how they react to the world about them, how they spend their leisure, or how they function along with other elements of the social order. In our schools, and especially in schools of religion, attention should be given to the study of the Negro as he developed during the antebellum period, by showing to what extent that remote culture was determined by ideas which the Negro brought with him from Africa. To take it for granted that the antebellum Negro was an ignoramus, or that the native brought from Africa had not a valuable culture merely because some prejudiced writers have said so, does not show the attitude of scholarship. And Negro students who direct their courses accordingly will never be able to grapple with the social problems presented today by the Negro Church. The preachers of today must learn to do as well as those of old. Richard Allen so interpreted Christianity anew to his master that he was converted, and so did Henry Evans and George Bentley for other whites in North Carolina and Tennessee. Instead of accepting and trying to carry out the theories which the exploiters of humanity have brought them for a religious program, the Negroes should forget their differences and in the strength of a united church bring out a new interpretation of Christ to this unwilling world. Following the religious teachings of their traducers, the Negroes do not show any more common sense than a people would in permitting criminals to enact the laws and establish the procedure of the courts by which they are to be tried. Negro preachers, too, must be educated to their people rather than away from them. This, of course, requires a new type of religious school. To provide for such training, the Negro Church must get rid of its burdensome supervisory force. If the number of bishops of the various Negro Methodist churches were reduced to about 12 or 15, as they should be, the amount of $100,000 or more now being paid to support the unnecessary number could be used to maintain properly at least one accredited college, and what is now being raised here and there to support various struggling but starving institutions kept alive by ambitious bishops and preachers could be saved to the people. With this money diverted to a more practical use, the race would be able to establish some other things which would serve as assets rather than as liabilities. We say liabilities for practically all of our denominational schools, which are bleeding the people for the inadequate support which they receive, are still unable to do accredited work. There are so many of them that the one impoverishes the other. Outstanding men of the church therefore have to acquire their advanced education by attending other schools in the beginning, or by taking additional training elsewhere after learning all our denominational schools can offer. This is a loss of ground which should be regained if the church is to go forward. By proper unification and organization, the Negro churches might support one or two much needed universities of their own. With the present arrangement of 2 or 3 in the same area, and sometimes as many in one city, there is no chance for emerging from the trying, poverty-stricken state. And even if these institutions could do well what they undertake, they do not supply all educational needs. To qualify for certification in the professions, Negroes must go to other schools, where although they acquire the fundamentals, they learn much about their quote-unquote inferiority to discourage them in their struggle upward. We should not close any accredited Negro colleges or universities, but we should reconstruct the whole system. We should not eliminate many of the courses now being offered, but we should secure men of vision to give them from the point of view of the people to be served. We should not spend less money for the higher education of the Negro, but should redefine higher education as preparation to think and work out a program to serve the lowly rather than to live as an aristocrat. Such subjects of certitude as mathematics, of course, would continue, and so would most of the work in practical languages and science. In theology, literature, social science, and education, however, radical reconstruction is necessary. The old worn-out theories as to man's relation to God and his fellow man, the system of thought which has permitted one man to exploit, oppress, and exterminate another and still be regarded as righteous, must be discarded for the new thought of men as brethren, and the idea of God as the lover of all mankind. After Negro students have mastered the fundamentals of English, the principles of composition, and the leading facts in the development of its literature, they should not spend all of their time in advanced work on Shakespeare, Chaucer, and Anglo-Saxon. They should direct their attention also to the folklore of the African, to the philosophy in his proverbs, to the development of the Negro and the use of modern language, and to the works of Negro writers. The leading facts of the history of the world should be studied by all, but of what advantage is it to the Negro student of history to devote all of his time to courses bearing on such despots as Alexander the Great, Caesar, and Napoleon, or to the record of those nations whose outstanding achievement has been rapine, plunder, and murder for world power? Why not study the African background from the point of view of anthropology and history, and then take up sociology as it concerns the Negro peasant or proletarian who is suffering from sufficient ills to supply laboratory work for the most advanced students of the social order? Why not take up economics as reflected by the Negroes of today and work out some remedy for their lack of capital, the absence of cooperative enterprise, and the short life of their establishments? Institutions like Harvard, Yale, and Columbia are not going to do these things, and educators influenced by them to the extent that they become blind to the Negro will never serve the race efficiently. To educate the Negro, we must find out exactly what his background is, what he is today, what his possibilities are, and how to begin with him as he is, and make him a better individual of the kind that he is. Instead of cramming the Negro's mind with what others have shown that they can do, we should develop his latent powers that he may perform in society a part of which others are not capable. During his life, the author has seen striking examples of how people should and should not be taught. Some of these are worth relating. Probably the most interesting was that of missionary work in China. In 1903, the author crossed the Pacific Ocean with 26 missionaries who were going to take the Orient by storm. One Todd from North Carolina was orating and preaching almost every day to stimulate his co-workers to go boldly to the task before them. Dr. DeForest, long a missionary to Japan, informed them that the work required more than enthusiasm, that they could not rush into the homes of the natives saying, quote, "Peace be unto this house," for it might turn out the other way and give somebody the opportunity to say, "Peace be to his ashes." Dr. DeForest explained to them how he chose a decidedly different course, preferring first to study the history, the language, the manners, and the customs of the people, to approach them intelligently. And not until he had been in the country 4 years did he undertake to exhort, but after that he had great success and had been invited to preach before the Mikado himself. Now Todd did not take this advice, and he had not been in China 5 months before he and his wife had been poisoned by their native cook, who had become incensed at the way they interfered with the institutions of his people. Another striking illustration was the education of the Filipinos. Not long after the close of the Spanish-American War, the United States government started out to educate the Filipinos overnight. Numbers of quote-unquote highly trained Americans were carried there to do the work. They entered upon their task by teaching the Filipinos just as they had taught American children who were otherwise circumstanced. The result was failure. Men trained at institutions like Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and Chicago could not reach these people and had to be dismissed from the service. Some of these quote-unquote scholarly Americans had to be maintained by the subscription of friends until they could be returned to this country on government transportation. In the meantime, however, there came along an insurance man who went to the Philippines to engage in business. He had never taught at all, and he had never studied authorities like Begley, Judd, and Thorndike. But he understood people. Seeing that others had failed, he went into the work himself. He filled the schoolroom with thousands of objects from the pupils' environment. In the beginning, he did not use books very much, because those supplied were not adapted to the needs of the children. He talked about the objects around them. Everything was presented objectively. When he took up the habits of the snake, he brought the reptile to the school for demonstration. When he taught the crocodile, he had one there. In teaching the Filipinos music, he did not sing, "Come shake the apple tree." They had never seen such an object. He taught them to sing, "Come shake the lomboy tree," something which they had actually done. In reading, he did not concentrate on the story of how George Washington always told the truth. They had never heard of him and could not have appreciated that myth if someone had told them about it. This real educator taught them about their own hero, Jose Rizal, who gave his life as a martyr for the freedom of his country. By and by, they got rid of most books based on the life of American people and worked out an entirely new series dealing with the life of Filipinos. The result, then, was that this man and others who saw the situation as he did succeeded. And the work of the public schools in the Philippines is today the outstanding achievement of the Americans in that country. We do not mean to suggest here, however, that any people should ignore the record of the progress of other races. We would not advocate any such unwise course. We say, hold on to the real facts of history as they are, but complete such knowledge by studying also the history of races and nations which have been purposely ignored. We should not underrate the achievements of Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, but we should give equally as much attention to the internal African kingdoms, the Songhai Empire, and Ethiopia, which through Egypt decidedly influenced the civilization of the Mediterranean world. We would not ignore the rise of Christianity and the development of the church, but we would at the same time give honorable mention to the persons of African blood who figured in these achievements and who today are endeavoring to carry out the principles of Jesus long since repudiated by most so-called Christians. We would not underestimate the achievements of the captains of industry who in the commercial expansion of the modern world have produced the wealth necessary to ease and comfort. But we would give credit to the Negro who so largely supplied the demand for labor by which these things have been accomplished. In our own particular history, we would not dim one bit the luster of any star in our firmament. We would not learn less of George Washington, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, but we would learn something also of the 3,000 Negro soldiers of the American Revolution who helped to make this quote-unquote father of our country possible. We would not neglect to appreciate the unusual contribution of Thomas Jefferson to freedom and democracy, but we would invite attention also to two of his outstanding contemporaries, Phyllis Wheatley, the writer of interesting verse, and Benjamin Banneker, the mathematician, astronomer, and advocate of a world peace plan set forth in 1793 with the vital principles of Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations. We would in no way detract from the fame of Perry on Lake Erie or Jackson at New Orleans in the second struggle with England, but we would remember the gallant black men who assisted in winning these memorable victories on land and sea. We would not cease to pay tribute to Abraham Lincoln as the quote-unquote savior of the country, but we would ascribe praise also to the 178,000 Negroes who had to be mustered into service of the Union before it could be preserved, and who by their heroism demonstrated that they were entitled to freedom and citizenship.